My name is Paul Polansky. I'm an American writer, mainly a poet, and for the past 20 years I've lived with gypsies in mainly Eastern Europe. I had lived with them as an anthropologist, but I write about them as a poet. Collecting their oral histories, and I've filmed and published more than 400 oral histories I've taken from gypsies in 19 countries. I've come to the conclusion that there were many different poor castes that left India at the beginning of the 11th century. One of the main groups was from Multan, which was the ancient capital of Punjab. And there, Multan had been ruled by the Carmathians, fundamental exiles, fundamentalist Muslim exiles from Egypt. Multan was ruled for 300 years by them. And as was the common thing in those days, exiles always called their new city, their new land, after where they came from. So the Carmathians called Multan Little Egypt. And when the Sun Temple was destroyed in 985 by the Carmathians, forcing many people to flee, especially the gypsies who were beggars at the Sun Temple. The gypsies thereafter referred to themselves as coming from Little Egypt. Later, you had many gypsies congregating in Armenia and the Middle East, and the Orthodox priests came to Armenia and said to the gypsies, and I have this from their oral tradition, that if you change your religion and become Orthodox, we will give you a job. Now, many gypsies left India, not only from Punjab and Rajasthan, but also from Kashmir, mainly seeking work. And so the offer of work was accepted by them. They became Orthodox, and they went to Mount Athos, and they built most of the monasteries. But what happened was that most of those gypsies were sold in slavery to build more monasteries throughout the Balkans. In fact, if you go to any monastery in the Balkans, the closest graves to that monastery, the closest homes, settlement to that monastery are gypsy communities. Some escaped. You had many gypsies that went to Albania, and then when the Catholic Albanians were driven out by the Turks in the 15th century, they came to Calabria with the Albanians, and from Calabria they went to Sardinia and then on to Spain by boat with the Catalans. You know, in India at the time that the gypsies were living there, you had a caste system, and the caste system went by profession. And although the gypsies have not followed strictly the caste system as they migrated into Europe, they still kept their caste name or translated their caste name, i.e. their profession, into the language of the country they lived in. And so you had many different castes, poor castes, leaving India. The gypsies did not leave as one group. They left as many groups, and they didn't even leave in groups. They might have left in family units. And it's been a chain migration going on for hundreds and hundreds of years. People always consider gypsies as to be uncivilized, and yet they've kept alive our own mother tongue. They're the only people who speak a form of Sanskrit today, and yet our European languages are mainly descended from Sanskrit. You can see that they came from different regions. For example, many gypsies, they use the word pai for water. That's really a Kashmiri word, and others use pani for water, and that's a Punjabi Rajasthani word. So you can see they came in from different areas at different times. The gypsies arrived in Calabria with the Albanians in the 15th century, 16th century. And they became a very important part of the agricultural community in Calabria. They made most of the horseshoes. They repaired most of the farm implements. They sowed the crops, they harvested the crops. They went from town to town to pick cherries and pick olives, and they were a very important element in the agricultural economy of Calabria. But after World War II, that small agricultural economy collapsed. The farms either disappeared or became very big, were mechanized, they're using machines to do all the work. The people moved into the cities. They were hired to work in factories. But of course, the factories, the last people they would hire are dark-skinned gypsies. And so suddenly you had the gypsies had no jobs in agriculture. They couldn't make the shift into the industrialization in the cities, and so they were looked down upon as parasites. And it's only today that gypsies have a bad reputation in Italy. Before World War II, they were highly respected. After World War II, you started to have legal and illegal camps for gypsies. They were called nomadic camps, although the gypsies really weren't nomads. They usually lived in a home during the winter and then traveled in the summer from town to either sell what they'd been making in their homes all winter or to find seasonal work in the agricultural sector. They weren't really nomadic, but the government considered them nomadic and put them in camps, and those camps exist to this day, and yet these are Italian citizens. Of course, you have the makeshift camps, which are now being made by the refugees who are still fleeing from the Balkans, from the genocide and discrimination in the Balkans. Well, first of all, the abused become the abusers. The Serbs abused the Albanians. When the Albanians took over control of Kosovo, they abused their minority. It really wasn't a religious war, it was a racial war. And the gypsies were caught between two fires, and in most places they lost their homes. In Kosovo, before the war, and I did a survey for the United Nations, there were 17,000 gypsy homes. After the war, after the Albanians returned from exile, after NATO troops occupied Kosovo, the Albanians destroyed more than 14,000 gypsy homes. They forced more than 100,000 gypsies to flee. Most went to Germany, many to Italy, some to the Nordic countries. Panic migration from India to Afghanistan, from Afghanistan to Iran, from Iran to Turkey, from Turkey to the Balkans, and then to Europe. Well, there was a real tragedy. Thomas Hammarberg, the former European consul, chairman for human rights, called it the worst human rights tragedy in the last decade. The United Nations World Health Organization called it the worst medical tragedy in Europe in the past 10 years. And what happened was that after the Albanians returned, after the 1999 war, after NATO troops occupied North Mitrovica, the Albanians were allowed to chase 8,000 gypsies out of their community in South Mitrovica. They became homeless. Those who didn't flee abroad were put in makeshift camps on toxic wasteland. The UN said that was the only land available. Well, that was back in December 1999. And 12 years later, 13 years later, there are still families living in this UN camp on toxic wasteland with the highest lead levels in medical literature. In fact, every child conceived and born in this camp is born with irreversible brain damage. We've had more than 100 deaths in this camp. And yet, until recently, the international community has turned a blind eye because these are gypsies. If they were Americans or Brits or Italians, they would have been saved. But because they were gypsies, they were left. You know, it took me 10 years to get the European Union and USA to build 100 homes for these families back in their old community. But they haven't finished the job. We still have 17 families living on the toxic wasteland. Slowly, they are moving, resettling them, but they are not treating them for lead poisoning. You know, the World Health Organization said these people not only had to be resettled off the toxic wasteland, but they had to be medically treated. They're not being medically treated. Their lead levels are still 4 times higher than the level that causes irreversible brain damage. We are going to end up with a complete generation of gypsy children that cannot father another generation. Maybe that's what's behind all this. And so this diaspora has not only started in 985, but is continuing to this very day. You know, every gypsy family in the Balkans who can afford to pay a smuggler to take them abroad is leaving, searching for a better life. That's what they've been doing for 1,000 years, searching for a better life, just like many Italians went to America to search for a better life. You cannot deny people the hope of having a better life. And that's what all this migration and immigration is about. Well, I just wish people would look back at their own history. You know, every family in America came from an immigrant family. We were all immigrants. And most families in Italy, if you look back at their history, come from an immigrant family. Whether it was people from Calabria going to Turin looking for a better life, a better job. You know, we all have an immigrant background. And so we have to understand why the immigrants today are coming to our countries. They're trying to have a better future for their children. These are European citizens, these are human beings. They're the largest minority in Europe, but people are not treating them as human beings. And this is the bottom line. This is the real problem. You have to find a humanitarian solution. This is not 1939. This is the 21st century. You cannot try to push these people out of sight. You cannot dehumanize them. These are human beings. I know there's problems, you know. No one's going to deny that there are problems. There are always problems when you're dealing with a group of very poor people. We saw this 100 years ago in America, especially in New York City. We had a group of dirty, filthy, parasite Italians. We had to integrate them. And they, of course, then made great contributions to the American society. But in the beginning, they were called thieves and parasites, uncivilized. And so, you know, Italians especially have to look back at their own history. They too were immigrants. They too suffered poverty. They too got off the same boat the gypsies are getting off of today.